Hello, everyone. Welcome to Adventures Through the Mind, possibly for the first time. Possibly you are returning after several episodes. This is episode 97. Maybe you've been with me since the beginning. Maybe you're just tuning in. Welcome, nonetheless. Today's episode is with Samantha Retrosi. A former Olympic athlete, Samantha Retrosi is now a PhD student investigating the sociology of culture, structural inequality, gender politics, and political economy at George Mason University Department of Sociology, and is writing her dissertation based on qualitative social research conducted over a 5-month period at the Ayahuasca Retreat Center, Temple of the Way of Light in Peru. She is on the show today to talk about healing with ayahuasca, what that means and what that takes, and the importance of understanding that our healing process goes beyond the personal and must extend beyond the personal into the social as well as the political if we are to achieve any true actual healing. We start out actually exploring her journey as an Olympic athlete and how that informed her progression into severe bulimia, and then how that eventually brought her into ayahuasca, and then the role ayahuasca played in her healing process, as well as how it informed her investigation into the civilizational sociological root of illness and healing that we in the Western world are nested within. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm feeling a bit scattered today when I shoot this interview, but thankfully during the interview I was sharp as a Ginsu knife. Is that what they were called back from the 90s? There was those TV commercials for the Ginsu knives. Is that right? Anyways, point is that I'm feeling really good about this interview, and I'm very happy to be bringing it to you. And I'm also really happy to be bringing it to you as a follow-up, although mutually independent, both interviews. I'm releasing it now to follow up from the last episode with Kevin Tucker, which took a pretty grim we'll say bleak but important investigation into the history of colonial extraction, ethnocide, and genocide that is ultimately infused in the ayahuasca industry. And that was a pretty critical look. And Tucker, essentially, said, no, we shouldn't be taking ayahuasca. So I thought it was important to bring Samantha on right afterwards, because she is also pretty versed in the larger socio-political issues around Amazonian extractivism and colonialism and civilization, but also believes in the healing power of ayahuasca. So this isn't something to be listened to so that, Samantha is always being in reference to Kevin Tucker by any means, but I wanted to release this one right afterwards because those painfully truthful negative context around ayahuasca is not the entirety. It's not the whole picture of the ayahuasca industry or the essentially growing ayahuasca worldwide culture. And I think Samantha does a really good job of representing that. Before the interview starts, I just have a little announcement, which is that between June 25th and July 10th, I am very excited to be in Alberta. I will be doing a talk in Calgary on compassion and psilocybin, which I was doing in Europe last year, and very happy to be bringing the next step development of that talk to my homelands of Canada, and in particular a place that I have a lot of heart for, where I started my career, which is in Calgary, Alberta. And I'll also be teaching at Rainbow Fiddle Music Festival and Astral Harvest Music Festival. 2 different talks are going on there. Details for that can be found at jameswjesso.com/events. And I'll put a link in the show notes to this episode. There's a promo code to get a discount on your ticket at Rainbow Fiddle. I think there's one promo code left, actually, so might not be there by the time you check, but possibly you'll get the discount. Anyways, I would love to see you there. Please come check me out in Alberta. Again, links are at jameswjesso.com/events or in the show notes to this episode. Big love to my patrons on Patreon. My God. Yeah. And I feel so grateful that I can do this with my life and invest so much into building this content for you and for like the larger you, and be able to eat and pay my rent and invest in keeping, the lights on, as well as progressing the development of the show technologically, as well as conceptually, thanks to the regular income that my patrons enable me. So huge, big thank you, patrons. Wow. Specifically, the patrons whose names are listed on the screen here if you're watching on YouTube, or listed in the show notes to this episode, who are giving very generously. For those of you who are listening and enjoying the show, send a thanks out energetically to the patrons and other supporters of the show who leave one-time donations or buy merch, because they make the show available for you. They help make the show available to you for free and regularly. So send them a thanks energetically with your heart. Just breathe it in. And if you would like to become a patron, please do. You head to patreon.com/James W. Jesso. Other support options include cryptocurrencies, PayPal donations, or buying some kind of merch. All of those options can be found at jameswjesso.com/support. So thank you for going ahead and helping support the show. If you can't financially support the show, tell a friend, share it on social media. That's also really appreciated and helps other people come to the show. And it's a really great non-financial way of supporting the growth and sort of like foundational integrity of the show's existence. So big thanks for that too. Okay, so this is my interview with Samantha Retrosi, episode 97 of Adventures Through the Mind. Listen for the dog. Enjoy. So, okay. How do you feel? You feel ready?
Yeah. I'm a little worried just because I certainly write a lot better than I speak sometimes when it comes to complicated things in terms of remembering the layers of everything, but it'll be fine no matter what. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, assuming that you do your best, that's what we'll get. So.
Yeah. I watched so many of the episodes because I had never seen your podcast before. But there were so many amazing people that I was partially intimidated, and then also just really happy that you had me on. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. Hey, I'm excited to have you on the show. I mean, I had really no reason to know who you were because I'm not a follower of the Olympics, so I wouldn't know you exist in that camp. And I'm not particularly involved in the work that's happening in Peru insofar as ayahuasca centers, although I am aware of the Temple of the Way of Light. So it was when I saw your talk at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference that I was like, oh, I mean, impressed sounds weird, because if I say I was impressed, then it gives the sense that I had low expectations for you. But it was more like I felt excited. I felt excited about the idea of having your mind here on the podcast. So I'm happy to get it together.
Yeah. I'm a bit of a recluse anyway, so I don't really Zoe was trying to get me to promote myself. I mean, I have a hard time with that kind of stuff. So it's not weird that you wouldn't know who I was. Nobody does. Yeah.
Well, that is about to change, Samantha. Why don't you give us a brief synopsis of how you went from a career as an Olympic athlete to not only in academia, but living in Peru in the psychedelic realities of the Amazon jungle as a part of your academic research.
Yeah, that's kind of a convoluted story. I'll try to make it as concise as possible. But like a lot of people who first come to either drinking ayahuasca or working with it in deeper ways, I mean, I came because I was not well. So I have spoken a little bit about sort of the past with my Olympic career, and I think that experience was pretty formative for me, because that was kind of my first entryway into the understanding that reality is not what it presents itself to be, right? We have this amazing, beautiful picture of what the Olympics supposedly are, what they're about, what they represent. The public image of the Olympics is one thing, and the experience of it is another thing. So from that experience in my life, I think I was just very well attuned to needing to look a little bit deeper underneath the surface of reality to see what else is going on here, like what's going on that's under the surface. But that being said, I was also deeply immersed in that culture and in that social space, and that way of life from the time I was really little. So with some of the more obscure sports, like the winter sports, especially like luge, there are only 2 tracks in the entire country. Where there's one in Utah and there's one in Lake Placid, which is, I mean, they're located there because they had the Olympics there. Very different time periods, but and so to develop athletes that are in such sort of site-specific sports, I mean, there's a lot of winter sports like that. But you have to leave your family. So you essentially, like, I left my family as a little kid. 11 years old, I guess that's still pretty little. And so I was really deeply immersed in a context without the guidance of my family, or in that social context, without a whole lot of sort of experience outside of that world. Like we actually, we had a tutor. Most of the time we weren't going to public school. Our friends were there. Our mentors were there. The people who we worked with and trained with were all there. It's a self-contained little sort of bubble. And so again, that's a really sort of vulnerable place, especially for a kid. Those are still early years of formative psychological development. And so, things happened in that space, which left me in a pretty bad way. It's hard to see when you're inside of it, what's going on, because I think it's like, I hate to compare it to like a cult because that's sort of a ridiculous reference, and yet it also is not. But I think really unfortunate things can happen to people when they don't have an external frame of reference. So things that were really not okay, that were happening inside of that world, I didn't even realize that they weren't okay. And it took me getting the perspective of that was required that I leave the sport to start to look back retrospectively and say, like, hey, that really wasn't okay in terms of how a child's psyche is going to be formed inside of that environment. So for, like, most elements of our society, I mean, that's a very gendered world as well. I think about that world as like a sort of a microcosm of the larger culture. So it's the larger culture in a heightened form. And so many of the things that we see that are problematic elements of structural inequality inside of the larger macro level context of Western culture and society, we could see them in a really heightened form in that world. And one of those things, of course, is gender. And so for me, growing up as a young girl and a young woman in that environment, there were ways that I had internalized my relationship to my body as an elite athlete, which were gendered as well, which then later kind of came to bear upon me after I retired, in ways that I could at that point recognize as really, really, really deeply problematic, and something that was, a form of dis-ease, or a form of I think of it as social illness instead of like biological illness, and sort of like psychological unrest that I had experienced. So it took me quite a while. I mean, I retired when I was 21. And then I started college. I started undergraduate studies.
Now, before we go there, you've been explicit elsewhere, and I've been reading up on your story. Can I just, because those were very gentle references, but I think that the explicits are part and parcel of the power of the story. Do you mind if I just check in with certain explicits that you might have been referencing to?
Oh, that's fine. Yeah. It's hard for me, but it's fine. Yeah, it's important.
Okay, so as a young girl, and you're at this time, what, like 12 to 20, or 15 to 20, or something like this, you are essentially being groomed to be an Olympic athlete, which is extreme levels of like body perfectionism, which include being constantly sort of tested and checked and ridiculed or praised for very lean, sort of unrealistic body type. for you inside of a context where the coaching was extreme praise or extreme degradation for failure,
Yeah.
which when you finally left the sport, you realize that because of the social context in which your brain and your psyche were developing, which was that, we'll say like a cult. I think it's fine to call it a cult personally, but that
Fine line, right?
right, that it ultimately led you into such intense issues with body image that you led into an eating disorder, which was, I believe, bulimia. Is that correct?
I mean, so it's actually even more strange than that. I think it was less about body image and more about pain, right? So, of course, the body to an elite athlete, like the condition of the body is of great importance. Of course, like your mental game is really important, but the mental game is nothing without the biological capacity to perform. I mean, they're interdependent and not separable, as we know, many of us know. But for me in particular, I had previous sort of issues that were a product of my familial life with my father in particular. But I have been somebody who success has been very important to me, right? Like performance standards have been very important. And so the way that I was relating to the condition of my body as an athlete, it's not even about body image so much as performance capacity and the capacity to succeed. And also the way that pain is the sort of the relationship that I had to pain. So when an elite athlete doesn't perform very well, and somebody like me who's, I'm a perfectionist before I even got into that sport as a little kid, firstly, the emotional pain of failure, of not performing, right? That's one layer of the difficulty, in needing to control the body, right? When you can't control the body to the extent that it will perform in the way that you need it to be successful, right? That's emotional pain. In a sport like luge, the one that I did, when there's an error made, there is also a physiological pain response. So, it's a sport where you're going, between 80 and 90 miles an hour in the dead of winter with nothing in between your body, no padding, nothing besides like a thin layer of spandex, right? You smash a wall, which is a common occurrence, like it's a pain response. If you crash, most of the time, extremely painful. In that, during the course of my career, I had 5 concussions. I had over 100 stitches. I had, the amount of like bruising and beating up that my body took, tendons, ligaments, knees, bones. There was also a pain response to not being able to control my body on the level of performance. There's the shame of not being able to perform. There's the physiological pain associated with error. And then we take that and we put gender dynamics over the top of that in a situation where you're a child, right? Like the age categories I started on the national team when I was 16. I was training with men who were up to their like mid-30s, right? And not just men from my sport. I was in like a compound essentially where the athletes live, the U.S. Olympic Training Center, where there are people from all over the world, from all different sports, coming there to train and live together. And so we had a lot of things going on there that were really unhealthy psychologically that do intersect with body image issues and the way that women's bodies are surveilled and assessed and critiqued in very public ways. And these public forms of shaming that came from the gendered social context within which I was embedded. So this is like a constellation of issues centered in the body, which are specific to elite athleticism, which are specific to, cultural forms of embodiment and gender norms. So this is just, this setting is like ripe for dysfunction. And when I retired, when I first started to try to come to terms with, what the heck was happening in my mind and my body, I was speaking with a sports psychologist that I had worked with during my career. And her statements were like explicitly, there are very few women who don't have extreme body image issues and who don't have, upon retirement, some like really great level of distortion in relation to their bodies. I mean, it's the vast majority of us. So this is the complicated context, and it's even more multi-layered than that. But this is the context of the emergence of the problem for me. Yeah, in relation also to my experience as a child, right, of being with my father. My father, he wasn't around, and then he died when I was 14, and so I had, childhood abandonment and parental death issues on top of this whole thing, right? So
and father hunger, I imagine, which would then lead to that vortex being filled quite easily with a dominating male coach.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was a male dominant power structure. I didn't have a single female mentor, coach, trainer. And like you said, I mean, I wanted to please the people who I had maybe contorted emotional relationships with, but I wanted to please them, right? I wanted that reinforcement. And I mean, 100%. Yeah.
Okay. Something else that's interesting to consider, and I'm not sure if that was into, like, you didn't explicitly include it just then when you continued to list off the layers of social and psychological complexity that you showed up into your life after the Olympics, which is ultimately like, you're not even done childhood, at 21 or whatever, you're not even done childhood really. And then you also have 4 concussions and traumatic brain injury. The consequence of traumatic brain injury looks like, for a lot of people, what is classified as a variety of mental health issues, from depression and anxiety to whatever way it happens to manifest, simply by the nature of your own psychological sort of profile or the shape of your psyche at the time. It just makes every possible mental health issue vastly worse, because your brain just isn't firing properly, because it's sick, like it's damaged, it's trying to heal, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I don't have a whole lot of knowledge about, but it's something that I've always been sort of aware of as, something acting that I just don't really know how it's interacting with the later issues.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I went through a fourth or fifth concussion just around the same time of the onset of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, in hindsight, and this is something to think about, it's like, well, I look back on that time now healthy and say it was an incredible learning experience and a part of my journey of maturation. And I called it post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's exactly what it was. And also there was all these other contexts that led it to being even worse. And then there was also the context of the brain injury. And so then, but I can't chalk any of it up to just being a brain injury, nor can I chalk it up just to being a psychological phenomenon either. And the whole thing becomes this very rich sort of tapestry of context, all of which needs to be seen as the essence of the illness or the essence of the struggle, without necessarily needing to focus on one thing or the other as being the primary root cause of it, so much as focusing on how to best support towards healing, which perhaps points to where you're at now, or where you were at just before you got to where you are now, which is reaching towards ayahuasca, personally and also professionally as an academic. Can you give us a sense of that context? And then while doing so, tell us, what is your current research right now?
Yeah, I guess before I go into that, I was just, as you were describing that, I was reflecting on how many of the people that I grew up with who were from different sports, especially the extreme winter sports, the psychological issues that they struggle with upon retirement. And 3 of my friends, one of them was he medaled in the Olympics and 2 years later committed suicide. I mean, there were the amount of mental health issues, depression in particular, that I know that so many people who were very successful athletes struggle with. I somewhat do wonder if an element of that is, you're making me think a little bit differently about the possibility of the injuries that they experience, whether that's a part of what they're struggling with. I think a big part of it is that transition into a different way of life. You think about your social value in a very specific way, and then all of a sudden that's gone. You're done with your athletic career. You haven't built up anything else, and you have to transition into a very different social role, a very different place in your life, and that without being prepared educationally, occupationally, with any sort of outside resources. I've always thought about it in that way, but and so you bring up a whole different layer of
Yeah,
possibility there.
with that additional sense of like, and all of that is true, and what is also true is that the brain is even less capable of dealing with all of those complexities and all that gravity because it's injured, and the more stress is on the brain while it's injured, which includes all these social psychological stressors, like context stressors, the more the damage is worsened.
Yeah.
And I mean, the cutting, like right now, the cutting edge of the research on traumatic brain injury is like, it's scary what it's basically saying, which is something along the lines of like, the smartest, most responsible thing that we could do as a society is basically to end all contact sports for anyone under the age of like 25.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. And people are just beginning to talk about this in terms of like, I mean, here predominantly coming from the critiques of, professional football and those contact sports where the athletes are high profile, so people care what happens to them outside of their career. But really, really interesting set of considerations as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So back to your story.
Yeah. Sorry.
No. This is good. I think this is important. I mean, traumatic brain injury is serious, and it's directly related to your story here, and I think it's of interest to my listeners. And you're in university. Ayahuasca comes up somewhere in there. The psychological issues, the eating disorder you were dealing with, that's also in there. How did you get to ayahuasca, and what is it that you're doing with ayahuasca now, professionally and personally?
Yeah, so I mean, when I retired, I tried to start life, right? I tried to start a different life, but it wasn't until that point that I realized something was wrong, which I then avoided for a long time, a number of years, probably like 7 years after that. But yeah, I mean, I think I'd mentioned in the talk that I was giving at the conference that, an eating disorder, for example, seems to be something that's perfectly normal when you're an athlete, right? Sort of like surveillance of the body through exercise and nutrition. But then all of a sudden, like there's a vacuum opened up in your life, like all of the hours I dedicated every single day to developing that, like there's nothing, right? Like there's no way to control what's going on in the body. So, at that point in my life, I started to change, right? Like the body started to change, and that loss of control, it induced a sense of paranoia. Because if just going back to what I had said before, it was the loss of control of the body which generated the forms of pain that I was experiencing at that time for so many years during that delicate psychological stage. The sort of evolution of the eating disorder was for me a fear response, right? Like I can't control anymore what's happening with my body. I can't allocate 8 hours of training anymore. I tried to, fill a vacuum. And at that point it was exercise bulimia, right? So I tried to fill that with like an excessive running habit. But again, that became out of balance and certainly wasn't going to take up 8 hours of my day, right? I had to do other things. So at some point, the eating disorder kind of transitioned into sort of more of a self-starvation mode. And then, I became so out of balance with that like my body would reject food, right? So I would have an emotional and mental really great level of discomfort and fear and paranoia that would happen in the act of eating, but also the way that it would impact my body and would make me sick, right? So I mean, there was so many layers to the evolution of this thing, from exercise bulimia to like excessive over bulimia. And at one point, you can't go on like that for so many years without having an extreme level of depression as well. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you've got psychological issues that are massive, but then you've got what is the brain doing chemically? What is the body doing when there's no energy being put into the body?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I spent a couple of years just wanting to die, right? Like just suicidal fantasies. And I don't really know, you kind of lose track of what's creating the problem. And it's multi-layered, so there is no way to pinpoint it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a desire to not exist. Um, so, I mean, which is really interesting in terms of like the parallel to the body, right? You're like depriving the body of existence as well. So this sort of like suicide drive is manifesting on the biological level of you trying to like eliminate the presence of your body in the world. So many things there. But there came a point, and I mean, I had a vision of this in one of my ceremonies too, like showing me when things started to change. I became so, like, the sense of futility was so great that I asked for help. Like, I think it was probably that rock bottom point for me. Of course, like, I love my family, my mother so much. I would never do anything to myself that would also impact her. And there were many reasons, like, that I was not actually going to commit suicide, right? But I also didn't want to live. And there came a point when I knew that wasn't going to change, and I knew that there was nothing I could do to help myself in that state. And so I don't even know who I was asking. I was asking the universe for help. And then I started getting just a whole, I don't know. I mean, my awareness of ayahuasca, even at that point, like, it's now coming into the mainstream, but even at that point, it was still very sort of fringe. Mm-hmm. And it just came to me until I took it seriously. It was quite seemingly random how I came into contact with the where I would drink. I mean, I wasn't going to drink in the United States or outside of a context that I didn't feel was respecting the integrity of the plants or something. I had this awareness that I didn't want to participate in a distorted form of ayahuasca consumption by like pursuing it in the United States in a container. I didn't feel comfortable with that I would be respected, that I would be respecting, this powerful plant agent, right? I knew enough to be respectful, and I was political enough at that point to be very careful about what I was going to participate in terms of like the consumption of ayahuasca and all of the political and economic dynamics there. But I eventually came into contact with a space that I felt was right. I don't know how, I just knew that it was right. And I drove into the jungle and had my first ceremony with a bunch of people I didn't know. It wasn't a retreat center, but I knew about the healer who was holding the ceremony. I knew that there was integrity there. And that is the single most powerful experience that I have had with ayahuasca, and that put me on the path. And I only drank one time there before I left and didn't drink again for like 6 more months. Mm-hmm. But that broke the depression that I had been experiencing for a number of years, was immediately broken, never to return again. And I had to work through with more medicine work, many layers of the problem that I was experiencing with the eating disorder. But the depression was immediate. I was released of that. And that ceremony was so powerful that I just started to continuously walk toward the path of working with plants, and things evolved from there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I think that's a good time for you to like have this page break, because in my mind I'm like, okay, this is good, but I also want to go. I want to be careful that we don't make this this episode like a testimonial for how, like, another one of these ayahuasca saved my life testimonials, because what you have to offer, as rich as that is on a personal level, it's not really reflective of the full like intellectual and academic richness that you have to offer. So I'm glad that we hit a page break there. Maybe we'll backfill what's missing here later, but let's jump ahead. And you're now working at the Temple of the Way of Light, which is a retreat center somewhere near Iquitos in Peru. And you're doing sociological research there. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing at the Temple of the Way of Light and what your research is focusing on? Like, what's the question you're investigating?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a sociologist, which is informed by a lot of my previous studies, but more importantly, the context of my life and some ways that I've been engaged politically inside of the context that we're situated in, right? The state of advanced capitalist democracies. And so my interest in sociology has always been sort of geared toward political economy and understanding the multiple sort of layers of the organization of capitalism, right? The historical phases and emergences of capitalism, the effects that it's generating in the world, how it operates, what its mechanisms are. So I've been engaging in a path of study to understand that. But there came a point, I think, with that I became much more less interested in critique, right? Then so what now, right? Like how are we as a society going to move beyond all of these ways that we critique things and the sort of like destruction that we can observe in the world and the deep, profound sickness that we're observing on multiple levels in Western culture and society.
Yeah, because I mean, like, capitalism sucks, but it's not like we have very many other large-scale options that are all that much better. So now what? I love that. Instead of just critiquing it, so now what?
Yeah, it becomes, to me, the question is like, rather than critique, what are we generating? Like, how are we coming to terms with ourselves, what we're doing in the world? How are we shifting gears? How are we going to shift in another direction? What are we going to create in the world?
Yeah, how are we going to use the privileges that capitalism has offered some of us to make something better for all of us?
Yeah. And so for me, I mean, medicine work is a great intervention. It's a great intervention in the ways that we have internalized the systems level structure, which is the context in which we're embedded, which, as we know, when we start working with psychoactive substances, we start to realize, there actually isn't that great of a separation between myself and my interiority and what seems to be the external world. And to engage what seems to be the external world also requires that we engage the way that internal world, external world seemingly lives within us. And medicine work, to me, in a political capacity, really is a powerful intervention in that sort of interiorization process, which enables us to have a greater level of agency. A greater level of self-awareness, a greater ability to intervene in the forms of social conditioning, the ways that we've internalized the culture, the cultural context that we're immersed in. So we're able to start to observe how we've internalized that and then intervene. And so to me, healing with medicine work is, or psychedelics, I mean, not just ayahuasca, it's a path of empowerment, right? So I wanted to understand with my research, how is it that we're able to do that, right? And why? I mean, the first task for me as a researcher was really to start to look at what are the features of like disturbance that are held in common by people submerged in this context. So what are these? First of all, like, I really do problematize the idea of illness in the ways that a lot of psychology or mental health discourse wants to talk about what's wrong, right? We have these categorizations of this ever expanding catalog of these supposed like pathologies, right? Which are in many cases ascribed to like biological origin, right? Like this is fundamentally wrong with you. It's pathologized, right? Because we're trying to find a biological source. We're trying to find a genetic source of this dysfunction. It's in your body. It's not in the culture and society, right? So that really is it pathologizes people, but it also makes them think that their problems are individual.
Right,
and to look at, the symptoms of disturbance that people are experiencing, what these experiential dynamics are that are held in common, that was the first task of my research. So relocating disturbance from a pathologized, medicalized narrative, which is, steeped in biological determinism, to, hey, like, what are we all dealing with? Like, what is the context of our life, that collective container within which we've been immersed all of our lives? What is that generating that's held in common? And so, yeah, those are experiential features that are important to me rather than categorical ones.
So it's sort of like the difference between looking at your situation. If I came in and it was like previous situation, like, oh, So you have an eating disorder. It's called bulimia. It's a product of your depression, and your depression is a product of, it's probably a problem with your brain chemicals. So we'll drug you to fix your brain chemicals to make the problem that is the eating disorder go away, rather than saying, oh, you have an eating disorder. All right, that's obviously pointing towards something. The larger social, like psychological, social context that led to that is likely your career as an Olympic athlete while you were still a child, and then the intensity of that. Well, why did that exist? Well, that existed because of the priorities of a larger cultural system that you happen to be born into, and how that large, right? And then that is like, okay, so then where is the problem really? Right? Because all of these things at this point now, your bulimia, of course, it's a personal problem for you, as in like it's problematic, but the real problems, or the deeper problems, are actually rooted in the civilization, possibly in civilization itself as we know it, the domestication process, not necessarily in the person.
Exactly. And this is really, I mean, this gets to sort of this next stage, which is like, I was looking in my research at the experiences that people have had within the Western medical model. Predominantly the Western sort of like psychiatric model, and experiences that they were having with psychedelics as a form of healing, ayahuasca in particular, because of this very thing that you're talking about, right? Like, what are the solutions that our culture gives, right? Our culture is giving us pills. They're giving us, a long-term relationship with a corporate pharmaceutical company, which is a relationship of dependence. It's a relationship of dependence, which actually opens up a new market, which opens up a long-term consumer relationship. There's a really interesting, and this is why it's important for me to always be looking at how is this intersecting and interacting with the economy, with a particular organization of the economy, right? And an economy built upon perpetual expansion and growth, new markets need to be opened perpetually, right? And mass bases of consumers need to be maintained and actually expanded. And so this, disturbing relationship between a privatized medical model and these mental health discourses, which individualize, pathologize, and locate illness as biologically determined, right? These have very significant systemic imperatives attached, right? So something like a psychedelic agent is seeking to, as you know, it's seeking to heal an issue from the core by making you face it, rather than helping you numb it in the long term by a continued sort of avoidance strategy, which is facilitated by pharmaceutical relationship of pharmaceutical-based dependence as like healing, right?
Well, I wonder about that. Are you suggesting that these psychedelic agents have agency, or was that just sort of like a slip of the language? I don't know if you were trying to imply that, because it's obvious that, and it's not hard to imply that, in the larger economic structure, that, like you said, the expanse of a marketplace is the narrative. So the intent of these drugs is, there's a lot of really good people who give a shit or are doing their best within the context that they try to help people by prescribing these drugs, unaware of the larger social and economic forces that are manipulating the way that they help. But you can point to intent. It's very easy to point to intent, and that intent draws upwards into how society lives inside of people. But then when you point towards psychedelics and you say the psychedelic agent heals in a different way, are you giving agency to the psychedelic, or does that psychedelic have a neutral agency that's employed by the person?
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that at all. But I think what you just said is really important, right? Like, I don't like this sort of demonizing finger pointing that we tend to sometimes do when we get into this mindset of, deep criticality. To me, you point to that really important thing, which is these are systemic imperatives, right? Like consumption, for example, and the opening and maintenance of markets. Those are systemic imperatives. And those are, again, like earlier I was talking about the sort of predisposition to look at the mechanisms underneath the surface of reality, right? Those systemic imperatives don't announce themselves as reality to us. And there are a lot of people who are trying to do their best, and there are people who are trying to do healing work with something like corporate pharmaceutical. And I'm not saying that they're doing, that they need to be, I'm not pointing and ascribing some kind of like fault to them as individuals. But yeah, it's seeing the forest through the trees, kind of thing, which is not always easy to do, especially when we're immersed in a mental health epidemic, which, we can see the features of in many, many ways.
Right. And depending on the situation, a lot of these individuals, they're bound by what they can say and can do, and are bound with like even their physiological and psychological capacity due to like the severe dysfunction of how these institutions are set up for funding and service providing. I know you're in the U.S., very different than in Canada, but Canada, I think, has got it a lot better than the U.S. insofar as healthcare, but certainly both of them are putting so much stress on providers that it makes it difficult for them to even be good people a lot of the time, let alone excellent physicians.
Yeah, and I mean, given the scale of things, right? Given the scale of the people who are seeking help, it is. I mean, a lot of my research participants talk about this, they feel like a number. They feel like a human being on a conveyor belt being shoved through a medical system, which they can't afford, but like that's the option that they have, right? They're just trying to get by. So it's complicated. And this is why I do like to shift away from like pure criticality to like, okay, so what now? What do we do? And that's where the plants come in, or psychedelics. And I didn't mean to call them agents, I guess. Like I'm not giving them agency. I think that human beings approach them and use them in a variety of ways. Not some of those ways are not even beneficial, right? Some of them are actually have a darker element. And so I do think about these substances, or plants, as able to be called and drawn upon in very different ways by different people with different intentions. Intentionality is really important.
I agree. And to be fair, I often use the word agents, and do, depending on the substance, give some agency to them, because I do believe that plants have intelligence. But so I don't want to make it seem like I really put you on the spot there, although I kind of did.
It's okay.
I just wanted to be clear. Although that's the second time you've pointed towards not wanting to fall into heavy criticality.
I've been there. I've been in the state of being deeply, deeply critical, which actually was hurtful to me, right? Because that type of criticality, which is not creative or generative, it's merely destructive, becomes a form of self-destruction. And it becomes this sort of arrogant knowing, right? Like, I know what's going on. I know all the features of the situation. I'm pointing here. This is the issue. This is what's wrong. Here's how it works. To be sort of fixated upon knowing that, right, becomes this sort of like container of your own consciousness, which then becomes a form of despair and a form of futility and a form of sort of critical exhaustion, which is has its own mental health implications. And I've been there too. I've been there too. And I've moved beyond that with the help of psychedelics. But yeah, it's been a long path.
It's interesting too, because I'm going to, hopefully I won't forget, and I'm going to avoid just jumping straight into a question that really belongs later, because you and I had an exchange about Kevin Tucker and his work with seeing ayahuasca as the expression of a living reality of colonialism and resource extraction from the Amazon. And his work is very critical. And I wonder, like, okay, maybe I'm sensing a little bit of that in this particular text of him. And then I also think, like, it's important sometimes for us to open up and let our souls be like completely broken open and wrecked, so that we can really feel the full grief of despair that's on this planet that we are essentially profiting off of in order to have running water and walk outside at any time of day and feel safe and this type of stuff here in North America, certain places in North America. But I'm gonna table that for a while. I'm gonna put a pin on it, slide it to the side. I want to go back to your research specifically. You have been working at and correct me where I'm wrong here, you've been working at the Temple of the Way of Light for some time now, conducting interviews with people who are going down there. You might be helping with integration, I don't know, I can't remember, but you're conducting interviews at the very least as a part of your research, and you're asking people essentially like, why are you here? what are you like, what's wrong? What are you looking to get out of this? And from what I read, you had found what you called the 5 main registers of social illness and the 5 desires that people come to, which unfair, painfully generalization is, suggesting society as we know it is making us sick, and people are coming down to ayahuasca to heal that sickness. And you have the 5 main registers of social illness and the 5 main desires. What are they?
Okay, so yeah, I did my research in 2017, and then I conducted at that point 5 months of ethnographic work, immersion in the context, and also I did a large number of interviews. I'm a qualitative researcher, so my research pool is actually quite substantial for a qualitative researcher. I did 35 interviews that were in-depth, like 2-hour interviews with people, with guests, but I saw all of the guests who came through the temple in that 5-month period during my ethnographic work. So I was sitting in on the group sharing circles. I was sitting in on all of the integration sessions. And so I did interviews with, 35 people. But I worked with, interacted with, and sat in ceremony and in processing sessions and just the details of daily life with hundreds of people. And then I then came back for 4 months after that and was doing sort of follow-up research, which was ethnographic, but the interviews were done. And then during that time, I started teaching yoga there because I'm also a yoga teacher now. And then I started facilitation. So now I work there as a facilitator. And I have been, that started this last year.
Facilitation is like integration and preparation, or are you like sitting at the front of the room singing the songs kind of facilitation?
No. So the groups that come in, the retreat groups, they're 9-day, 12-day, 14-day, or 23-day. And the facilitators, there's like a team of 2 for 23, 24 people usually, a male and a female always. And we take them through the entire experience. So like we lead them through the schedule. We do one-on-one sort of processing with them to help them integrate their ceremonial experiences, but also lead them through all the preparatory stages and then the group processing sessions. And we sit with them. We work with the Shipibo in ceremony as well as a support system for the indigenous healers, but also for the guests in that context. So the facilitation role is it's like a cultural bridge between the Shipibo and the people coming from the Western context predominantly. But it's also the people who are sort of like taking them through the entire process as a cohesive whole.
Got it.
Yeah. So that's what that is. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry for derailing. You were you were talking about the extent of your research and then moving towards the registrars and desires.
Yeah. So the research was, it was assessing the context. And a big question for me was like, why now? Why is this happening now? We're seeing the globalization of ayahuasca. We're seeing a resurgence in interest in psychedelics, which went underground and was not as present in sort of the dominant culture. It's obviously surfacing again. And so my question is like, why? Like, what is stimulating that? Of course, I was looking at the context that was stimulating that interest in healing through psychedelics, why that's needed, why the Western medical model is not helping people who are seeking to look outside of it for healing, and then what are the plants doing that the modalities that people have worked with in the West for healing have not been able to do, and how is medicine especially, I looked at the ceremonial engagement with ceremonial ayahuasca, right? So it's a specific container. How do those practices work on issues that people have, that are embedded in people from the context of the West? Because obviously with ayahuasca, this tradition has been carried in a very different cultural context for a very long time. And so I was interested in seeing how people were working with that modality in a different cultural context than the one in which the illness was generated or the disturbance was generated. So the registers for me, we had, I sort of categorized them, right? I did my best to like name them, right? But again, sort of naming can be sort of problematic. So I try to keep it in an experiential register, which is uh, symptoms of disturbance, depression and anxiety, which usually go hand in hand, self-hatred, or self-hatred and an inability to love oneself. But again, they go hand in hand. A pervasive sense of meaninglessness and emptiness, feeling like there's no purpose for their life. Sensations of isolation, aloneness, alienation from themselves, others, and the cultural environment in which they're situated, this deep sense of aloneness, and inability to connect in meaningful ways. And then, of course, we have the range of patterns of addiction. I mean, these are addictions that are not just substance addictions. It could be addictions to food, to sex, to porn, to work, to patterns of consumption that are not explicit, shopping, etc. So addictive relationships to commodities of various sorts, essentially. And then the range of things that people wanted was also very, very low. I mean, this is like hundreds of people, and they can be like described in these 5 basic things that people want. They want joy. They want to be happy. They want to feel like their life has purpose and meaning. They're doing something in the world that's beyond themselves. They want to love themselves. They want to have meaningful relationships with other people. And they don't want to be addicted. They don't want to feel enslaved by something. And this is sort of the findings about A, what's wrong, and B, what do people want? Like, what do they really desire? Do they desire a huge house and a nice car and a TV? Like, maybe on a surface level, but what people really want on a deeper level are these things, these 5 things that I just spoke about.
Well, at least the people coming to Peru drinking ayahuasca with the hopes that it'll be the thing that saves them from the consequences of society. But your suggestion here, and I'm totally on board with you with this, is that these are issues that are created by the social context that we live in, that they are, of course, influenced by early family life, by genetic predisposition, by epigenetics and inherited family trauma, be that psychological or through genetic transference, maybe not the right word, but that the context of the family is also something that exists inside of larger social value system, and that society as we know of it today is fundamentally traumatic in and of itself. And for most people, if not all people, although some can hide it really well, unless intervened with, end up producing the registers that you talked about there, and those desires, and society attempts to then fulfill those desires with things that only would further worsen the illnesses, which is essentially nice cars, social power, distraction, amnesia or anesthesia. And that these addictions, that these issues, all of these, and I'm kind of like tracking back to what you were just saying before, like all of these things are new marketplaces that are ongoingly opening up. And so the sickness of the people benefits the structure of the society, which is one of extracting resources, converting them into commodities, and then utilizing those commodities to propagate the harvest of human labor to further produce those commodities and put a few people on top economically, socially, and politically, while everyone else suffers. Does that sound kind of fair?
I mean, it's very, you cover a lot of territory there. And of course, for me, it's always like there's like 8 million nuances inside of all of these things, which I should not go into.
Right.
But I guess, so maybe it's helpful if you like.
No, I'm just throwing things out there. Like I'm trying to understand where you're coming from here. Like, does that feel like it's a pretty fair generalization? Like, is society sick in this way? Is that what's happening? Is that why people are running to ayahuasca, hoping that it's like the last bastion of true spirituality left in the world?
I think we start like where you started with that was the nuclear family, right? which is a really interesting and relevant point of departure because of the fact that, I mean, in sociology, we kind of study the role of the family because because it's the first institution that human beings encounter. And it is the primary socializer, right? Like socializer, I made that word up. It's the primary or the first point of socialization and the most potent one because you have, of course, a baby being born into the world. It is literally the most delicate, most formative psychological stage in a human being's life. It's this stage of infancy and childhood. And so the family is an extremely significant sort of like psychological feature of people's, the way that they're oriented toward the world. The nuclear family is, of course, actually not like taken for granted as reality, right? It's culturally specific. It's historically specific. It has a particular role in Western culture and society, which is not cross-cultural, which is not trans-historical, right? And so a lot of people want to focus on childhood trauma for very clear, very good reasons. And I do think it's really important as a space of intervention, right? And when we're starting healing work. But that family, in the bigger picture, is embedded inside of a social context, which it is responsible for adjusting a child to, right? Adjusting a new being in the world to society. And so the society has to actually move into the child's experience through the family because the child has to be prepared to go out into that world. And so the society enters the psyche of a human being first through the family. And there are so many ways to think about that. I mean, one of the ways, a lot of people in, psychedelics, therapeutic work think about it is through like Jungian or Freudian psychoanalytic methods, in which, we're talking about the ego, right? The ego construction. In sociology, we talk about that as, self-construction and the sort of like the artificial nature of personhood and how somebody comes to adopt a centralized sense of self, which is particular, which is a personality structure, which is intimately informed by that which the culture and society requires. And the family has got to prepare that human being to enter into that larger social space. So the family connects the young human being, developing human being to the larger society. And so for me, it's not enough to simply look at the family as the site of trauma and disconnection and separation. We have to look at its social role inside or as a microcosm inside the larger society. And then we start to ask the question of, okay, so, if the family's socializing that role, like what is required of the family? What is the society asking of the family to implant into that person's psyche so that they can succeed in the world, right? What are the values that it's socializing? What are the social roles that it's imposing upon human consciousness? What is important? What is not allowed? What is pathologized? What is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see the relationship between the individual psyche, the society, and the way that the family mediates that, right? And I mean, you had mentioned just earlier, a discussion about like consumption and consumer capitalism and markets, and of course the family is also socializing how that person is entering into a political and economic system. And I mean, I'm getting long-winded here, but I don't know if you want to like zero in on.
Well, the thing is that we don't. These aren't things to be covered, extensively in a one to looking like possibly 90-minute podcast, right? Because they're too rich, and I understand my own desire, and I feel like other people can relate to the desire of being like, okay, but like, what is it, and then what do we do?
Yeah.
Right. And I get that. Absolutely. And yet it's kind of impossible to really determine that conclusively because it's so complex and it's so rich. To sort of back reference this other ecological thinker that I've been following recently, Joe Brewer, that like the extent of collapse, and he's talking about ecologically, that is present right now is inconceivable to the human mind. And I think the level of complexity that goes into like the things that we're talking about right now might be as a whole inconceivable to the human mind. And so, but we can point in all these directions, and we need to allow that complexity to inform us, and then the complexity of each context to inform how we show up to each context, and keep this trans-contextual awareness as we try to figure out, okay, but what is it right now, and what is the most effective way to move forward with whatever. So, so where are we right now? We're talking about society makes us sick, and some people are heading down to the jungle to drink ayahuasca in hopes that ayahuasca will help heal their sickness. So I'll ask you two questions that you ask yourself in your talk at Spirit Medicine Conference, which is, I'm referencing my notes. Oh my God, here we go. Well, I mean, one of them is kind of clear, but what is healing, and what exactly are we healing from?
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll start with what is healing. The way Tanya Mate, her name's Kamana now, she has a really beautiful definition that she's created, and this is her definition of integration, but it also works for me with healing. She calls integration, she refers to it as a plant-based process of learning, or a plant-based process of learning self-mastery.
And you're talking about, this is like healing with psychedelics specifically.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Healing with psychedelics, and she's referring to ayahuasca in particular, but I think we can see a lot of commonality in terms of the potentialities of ayahuasca and other psychedelic substances or plants as well. But so if we're thinking about, what are we sick with, right? Like, what is happening inside of a psyche when society is implanting itself in that psyche, right? Like, is that an authentic expression of that person's agency, that person's choice, that person's, I don't believe in talking about an essence, right? But I do believe in, or I can call upon quite a lot of examination of this particular types of examination of this question. What is an essential self? What's an authentic being, right? Like, I don't believe that I have a right to say that I know what that is. I'm kind of taking this perspective of unknowing about that rather than knowing, right? So society tells us that we're one thing, that we're something, we're these set of things, and that we need to be these things, right? And those are imposed upon us. Those are not chosen. A developing psyche does not get to choose the programs that are implanted within it at that formative stage. And so these things become operational as sort of like cognitive templates that are sort of populating our psyche. I think about it as like the colonization of consciousness. And there are other ways to think about that, but that's one framework through which I'm thinking about it. A lot of the time we actually don't have the ability to see that we are something different than what we think we are. Like, we are not our personality structure. We are not the ego that we've constructed to get by in the world, and that has been constructed for us and implanted, right, in the psyche. And so there's people that talk about this process of like cleaning and clearing the mind state, the mental field. And to me, a lot of that process, that the cleaning process, is coming to a point of clarity where when we drink the plants, we're observing ourselves. We're able to see these elements of ourselves. We're able to see things that are maybe not expressions of our higher will or of a deeper form of knowing, right? But they're behavioral patterns that we participate in, that we've been engaging in for a really long time for particular reasons, right? Because we've been separated from, this is that term separation, right? We've been separated from a more authentic expression of human consciousness, of existence and being, and the potentialities of that. And so this process of healing is about catalyzing our own ability to see ourselves more clearly, to see the layers of ourselves, and to have the agency with which to make decisions that are an authentic form of creative choice, rather than a program that's operating in the psyche as a form of identity construction, or I'm getting lost in sort of the complexity of this.
So let me see if I can, I can generalize here. Like we live, we've talked about society's influence on the family and family's influence on socialization, and it's pretty common understanding of how early childhood development, leans towards like adult perception of reality, perception of self, behavior, pathology, health, etc. So you're saying that when we're working with ayahuasca or psychedelic plants in general, what we end up doing is that part of what society does is it's our society, like modern Western global consumer capitalism society does, is it tries to make us invisible to ourselves in some way. I'm providing agency to the society, but something along the lines that makes it so that we can't really see ourselves. We only see ourselves as what it's told us that we need to be, which is ultimately makes us sick, because what it wants us to be is a good consumer, and unhealthy people consume more product. And that when we drink ayahuasca, for example, it helps to sort of decondition those things and look at ourselves differently, and as a consequence of that, enable a greater agency for choice, creative response, and eventually discovery of who we might be if we weren't being who we were told we were supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's a question that exists beyond just like the production of basic consumers. I think it's also a question of, what does the society value, in a greater sense? Like, if I think about, what we're told, right? So this is one point of departure. So we go to school, we are told to go get an education, we're told to get a job. Why should we get a job? So we can retire well, so we can buy a house, so we can have a car, so we can have economic stability, so that we can be good citizens, right? What does the society value? What are the markers of a good citizen? What are the markers of someone who's successful? And how do you get those things, right? So there's that whole set of things. And then there's the things that we really do desire: joy, meaning, purpose, self-love, ability to love others, deep and meaningful connections. So all of the energy that we're pouring into all of these things that we're supposed to want, and the ways that we're told that we are able to get them, right? We pour a lot of energy there, and that's one example, but we can locate it. We can locate it in gender, for example, as another alternative. What are we told that we should be as women? What are we told that we should be as men? What are the behavioral features of that? What are the emotional features of that? And what is lost there? Mm-hmm. How do we consume our way toward the image of what that is? And how do we display that we are that, right? What is lost along the way? There's this, I like the term dissociation, right? Because we're dissociating from our authentic sort of desires about what's gratifying as human beings, right? But in the process of, dissociating from the things that are creating trauma and separation, we're also dissociating from the things that are beautiful and that are good and that are meaningful in life. And so, or that are more deeply meaningful to us, right? So I think in one of our email exchanges, you were saying something about like the golden shadow, mm-hmm. which I think is a really interesting and really great framework through which to think about that as well. Like in this sort of trajectory of repression of that which is causing us pain. We're also repressing the things that we more deeply desire. So, healing through plant work or through psychoactive agents, psychoactive assistance, right?
Yeah.
It's about encountering sort of that which are authentic desires and that which are not, that which are gratifying to us in deeper ways and sort of sifting through those things that are not. I mean, I have this like sort of other kind of understanding of like shadow work, which is related as well, which is like, so all of the things that we're participating in that are not serving us, that are not hurting us, they're acting because we've dissociated from them. We've decided not to see them. When we decide not to see something, right, we lose the ability to actually regulate or channel it or recognize it in order to neutralize it. And so this process of ingesting plants, which help us see some of these darker features of ourselves, or of our shadow, if we want to call it that, or repressed unconscious selves, whatever it is that we're referring to it as. It's in the act of agreeing to see those things that we're able to then work constructively with them, or to recognize that they're there and choose not to empower them anymore. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, these are two different ways of thinking about healing
mm-hmm.
work.
So let's point to something then, because I like how it, we've talked about how rich and complex this is, and then I also like how there'll be moments where it's like I start to feel like the weight of how complex what we're talking about actually is, and I'm like, okay, I really hope she's holding it together, because like
I'm trying,
and then periodically I feel like there's moments where I feel like, oh, all right, now I'm holding it together, and maybe this is a place that I'm holding it together, or maybe we're just taking a little like short tangent and an eddy in this rushing river of curious investigation that we're on right now, which is suffering. Because you're talking about, when you're talking about how when we dissociate, when we anesthetize or amnesiate ourselves, forget or distract or like deaden ourselves from pain, we block ourselves from a greater joy. And I think about what the most common psychological complaints are for people who find stability on tricyclic antidepressants, which is like, yeah, I don't feel shitty anymore, but I don't feel happy either. And so it sort of puts a cap on things. And for myself in my own work, last year in Europe and this year again in Alberta, I'm going to be giving a talk that I talk about compassion, and I talk about how one of the best things that we can do for the world around us, for our friends, for our family, for society, is to get better at suffering.
Yeah.
And that suffering is skillful suffering, which is like, I'm feeling the pain that's really what is hurting right now, rather than reactive suffering, which is I'm feeling the pain that is a consequence of me fighting against what's really hurting me, like fighting against feeling the pain that's really there. So I'm feeling the pain of boredom, or I'm feeling the pain of like hatred against somebody else as a consequence of me not wanting to feel how empty I feel inside, or a consequence of me not wanting to feel the deep shame I have in mistreating another person, right? And that if we can learn to have this, like this skillful, authentic suffering, we can conduct ourselves as better citizens, as well as just generally psychologically healthier people, because being able to tap with our suffering and our grief and what have you gives us positive perspective on the joys of life. And you suggest in your talk too that suffering is something that's really important. And I'm curious then about ayahuasca and suffering.
This is a really good way to channel, because I think to get into the massive sea of the understanding of like healing with ayahuasca or with any psychedelic, it's hard to find a point of purchase, but this is a really good one. I think that this is an opinion, I guess, but it seems to me that suffering is an experience that's common to all humans. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things about the addictions, the rampant sort of addictions that we see in the West, evidence of that is quite substantial, and I could go into it, and I won't for the purposes of time. But I think one of the indicators of the dysfunction that we see through the rampant and expansive nature of addiction in the West is the fact that we have lost the ability to suffer, right? We're running away from suffering. We are not suffering, which is I think an experience common to all of humanity, not just in the West, to all of humanity. Obviously suffering is culturally, historically, and geopolitically, socially situated and unfolds in a particular way inside of an individual life, of course. And we see that contextually in the West in ways that we might not find somewhere else. But I think one of the indicators of a really deep dysfunction is the fact that we've lost the ability to navigate that as something potentially transformative, right? We are running away from suffering. We are trying to neutralize suffering. We are trying to avoid it rather than harness it as a tool of transformation and collective forward movement and transition into a new horizon of possibility, right? Like, it is holding us in place, this impulse toward running away from suffering and numbing suffering. And I think one of the most powerful lessons that we can learn from the very often very difficult experiences of ayahuasca healing is a new relationship to suffering. You consume something, like you cannot escape. You can't close your eyes and escape. You can't ingest something and escape. You can't run away. Like, you are literally left there submerged in many times very difficult experiences. And you're left to navigate that and learn rather than run away and avoid. And the really interesting thing about that is, hundreds of people I've now watched who agree to that process, to release into that and to surrender, many for the first time in their life rather than running away through a pattern of addiction or however people run away from it in their lives individually. They realize that actually agreeing to that means that they get access to that which they've also been missing out on, which is those mystical experiences, the transcendent experiences, the great beauty and joy that are also, I think, common to all of humanity and a potentiality that we all have. Because you see people go through that terrain of discomfort and fear. And I know from personal experience, like, it can be a hell realm. But on the other side of that, if you agree to that, on the other side of that is everything that you said you wanted. And so in many cases, like, we're able to start to reorient ourselves towards suffering as something productive, something necessary, something which is a form of empowerment rather than disempowerment, something that is an engine of self-transformation and evolution, something that actually has a set of positive connotations rather than something that we desire not to have. And so it becomes a very different relationship to struggle, which I think is a very fundamental aspect of healing with ayahuasca in particular. But again, I'm talking about a lot of psychedelic experiences. Yeah, agent, friend.
All right, so I'm totally on board with you there, and I want to ask, like, a deeper, more critical question here about specifically that premise. And I am, although it might not seem it in the question, I am entirely self-aware that my own biases and unresolved things might be informing this question, which I suppose all questions are informed by that in some way, which is one of the most common things I see among people who drink ayahuasca is that they continue to drink ayahuasca. When they're like, ayahuasca really worked for me, it's now a lifelong relationship with ayahuasca. And one of the things that I've realized is that there's no limit to the shadow. There's no limit to how far you go, and you can still find darkness. Even, talking to people like Christopher Beisch, who was a former guest on the show, who did like 90 or 70 something high dose LSD sessions. Even as he blasted out into realms of the cosmos far beyond, transcending the essence of time and space itself, he was still finding more suffering, right? There's no end to that. And so I can understand the ongoing regular use of ayahuasca for people who use it because they care about building a relationship to the plant, or it's a part of their religious or ceremonial culture. But insofar as healing and this idea of cleaning and purging, there's no end to that. And so we can drink 100 times and there'll still be more to clean and to purge? And at what point do people who are claiming that it's for healing need to like move on and get on with their lives and no longer go back to the ayahuasca? And then my question goes even deeper. It's like, is ayahuasca not so much showing us where our pain is, but causing us an ambiguous suffering, both dark and light? And it's our own mind that fills the spaces. And so then my larger question is, if we're moving in for healing, wouldn't the essence of having been healed then include no longer going back to hurt more?
Yeah, I think you're pointing to this a much bigger topic, which is you can do a whole lot of individual healing, your own personal healing, through ayahuasca, but there also is a point where you're tapping into this other thing that we come into awareness with, which is the fact that we are connected to a vast sea of the human collectivity or universal consciousness, not just human consciousness. And so from what I have observed, there comes a point where a lot of people start to tap into that larger sea of consciousness, right? And forms of suffering which are collective, they may be flowing through their individual consciousness in a ceremony, for example. But even doing your own healing work, say you got to a point where you had healed yourself, right, fully, you would be tapping into, just through that very process, you're coming into contact with the awareness that you are not separate from other beings. You are not separate from a larger pool of what's been happening through humanity, etc., across the entirety of our history, right? Our existence on this planet. And so I think this is where it becomes really important to start having the conversation about integration.
Well, before we go there, because I want to talk to you about integration, because I see where you're pointing to with the way that I formulated my question, which was really ambiguous, because I'm not entirely sure. I'm just thinking about these things. And I want to ask you about integration specifically in a second. But I want to say that I see a real interesting value, because I see the person not just as a transpersonal consequence or a consequence of transpersonal variables, but the person as being nested in, connected to, and impacting on a transpersonal essence of being. So that, when we go into these realms of collective suffering, I do believe something really positive is happening for the collective mind, be it in psychedelics or be it when I read a book about Amazonian extractivism and the rubber trade, and I fucking curl up and cry with grief because it was so intense what was done to those people, that I see that there's a value there. But my curiosity is about, and maybe I'm getting clearer on this, is that does the ayahuasca dark and light extreme become almost a dysfunction in and of itself, that we utilize healing as an excuse to just keep going back over and over again, rather than bringing what we've learned into a normal life and saying, well, I don't need to go back and suffer some more because there's more to be done in my deep self, or there's more healing to purge for the planet, there's more journey work to be done. At what point do we say, I need to stop that and I need to just show up to being a good person in my community, being a good person in my family, being a good person as a citizen, right? Rather than continuing to go back to drink ayahuasca and believe that simply by the nature of doing it, we're doing some sort of good, positive work.
Man, I have 4 different directions I want to go with that, so I'm going to try to keep on track here. I mean, what you're talking about, I've seen, I don't want to call it an addiction, because I definitely don't like to think about people becoming addictive to ayahuasca. But I think that a distorted relationship of sort of grasping clinginess to these experiences, I don't think that it's that strange, because I also think that, of course, in a process of dealing with that which is within us, which needs to be healed, that's going to come to the surface and that's going to emerge, right? And I think, one of the things that the people that I interviewed spoke about was the sense of numbness, this feeling of walking around in the world like a zombie, like a ghost, like not having deep experiences that they felt were meaningful. And sometimes it wasn't even the pain that they were feeling wasn't about extreme depression or extreme addiction. It was about being numb and not feeling meaning in their lives. And also the ways in which we're told that emotion is not valuable. Rationality and logic and measured sort of temperaments are, I mean, those are the ways of being in the world that are really valued. We're not taught to value our emotions, especially if you're, I mean, for men, like they're not even allowed to display that they have them in many cases, right? Like
except for lust or rage.
Yeah. And so I think something that can happen to people is like, this is a release valve for that, right? They're like, wow, I'm experiencing all of these things. Like this is being treated as valid and as a form of healing. And this is something that's allowed here. And secondarily, like to encounter situations where you're finding deep meaning, where you're finding something beyond yourself. Those aren't common experiences for a lot of us. So I think a lot of people can become sort of fixated upon having those experiences because we've been deprived of them in our cultural context. And there was another question that you had brought up earlier in our email conversation that was about, that it was sort of leading towards this discussion of like the fetishizing, like this fetishizing aspect.
Oh yeah, that's totally up for the next question, but please continue. Yeah.
I mean, it relates to that. In one way, it's kind of ugly, right? It's kind of disturbing to see that, right? You've got like the person who comes to one retreat and all of a sudden they're going to be a shaman, right?
Guilty. Excuse me. After the first one anyways, but please continue. Yeah.
But that makes quite a lot of sense though, because I mean, people see like a beautiful, rich tradition, which is like centuries old, which is, deeply impactful and deeply meaningful. And people want that, right? They don't have that. They don't have those experiences. But then there's the other aspect of that, which is like in our culture, we value status. So people start to have like a status orientation toward the shaman or the healer. And they want to be that, right? They want to be that because we're socialized to value social status and social escalation. And so these things are related to me. In the ways I'm thinking about this question, like this sort of grasping, clinging, addictive desire to repetitively enter the psychedelic space and not necessarily want to stop that or to have a clinging relationship to it as never ending or habitual or repetitive. I think that orientation toward medicine work is symptomatic of the larger set of issues that we're dealing with as people coming from the culture of the West. And I think I don't think about it in judgment. I think about it as simply sort of like, yeah, well, that's coming up to get healed too. Just like everything else that's coming up, like that's coming up too.
Interesting. Yeah. I think what you pointed to there really helped clarify what it was. I knew I was curious and unsure and critical about something, but yeah, you really pointed to it in a way that I didn't fully understand because I needed your answer to fully understand my own question. And I can definitely see how that would happen. It's almost like the ayahuasca can become a place for us to transfer our issues onto. And then since in many ways ayahuasca is a manifestation of our own interiority, that it can provide our cross transference as well. And then if we fixate on it as being the source of meaning, dark and light in our life, because I do think ritualistic suffering does bring a sense of meaningness or meaningfulness to life, that there's little effort to bring that, to make and build and generate structures of meaning in your life beyond it. And then, this becomes the only place where you can find it, right? Yeah. And which brings me to another question. Wait, before
you go to another question, can I have one more?
Please, yes.
Because there's one other direction that I wanted to go here because it's someone I'm really quite interested in and sort of passionate about. Like you were talking about just this perpetual entrance back into the psychedelic state. in ceremonies with the consumption of the substance, in this case, ayahuasca. And for me, that's also indicative of something in the scene, which I think there needs to be a point of intervention, right? So this orientation toward healing as an individual act, which takes place in the terrain of interiority, that's important because the collective is inside interiority as well. The society is in the psyche. However, if we, this may be a question that you'll have later, but if we desire to make our own personal healing work socio-politically meaningful, it has to move out into the world. We have to develop practices to deliberately make active in the world, which seems to be outside of ourselves, part of our healing work. And so just constantly going back into your own interiority to do your own healing work, I think is also a slippery slope, which can become deeply individualistic if we're not committed to externalize that which we're learning in the context of our everyday lives, in everyday practice, in the ceremony that is life. And I mean, that's like one sort of politicization of it, but then there's an even deeper level of politicization of this, which I think we have not really seen very much of, unfortunately. And I'm hoping to see more of it and maybe be involved at some point in some more of this. But, this work being explicitly directed towards social and political forms of transformation. Like, we know that psychedelics respond to set and setting and intention. We know that they respond to the container that is set in terms of the healing work that we're doing. And so if we want to do the work inside of ourselves and in the actual world, we're going to have to start developing socio-politically oriented intentions and containers and objectives for the medicine work that we're doing so that it does move into the real world. Because right now we've got this really interesting sort of like self-project narrative happening in some ways, right? Sort of this, it almost like, this sort of like self-entrepreneurialism type thing, which is like doing work on yourself, working on yourself as a project, self-development as another form of identity construction, which is projectified. And there's I think there's a great level of individuality, which can again be transferred onto this scene, or individualism, which is a manifestation of the illness rather than like the healing.
Which I totally see pretty heavily in the microdosing culture right now too, which is like self-optimization and biohacking and psychedelics as agents of basically being like more of, happier, healthier, less depression, less anxiety, so that you can win at the capitalistic game.
Yeah, the happy robot, right?
Right. Or like the happy, self-aware agent inside of the larger robot that's like doing good for the larger robot's goal or whatever. But I think that's really interesting thing to point to. Actually, I'm glad that you brought that up. One of my former guests, his name was Sebastian Job, and he said that one of the directions he thinks we should be going in psychedelic work is for community leaders to get together, and the context being about what are the issues that we're facing as a community, and then the journey together on those issues, and then to come back and refer to each other from ceremony. All right, what did we learn about this that could contribute to resolving these issues or building like a better community or cultural structures to prevent the development of those issues further over time. So I definitely think that's an very interesting sphere to bring into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, we do see it. This is why, like, I know that, I was given a grant by Zoe's organization, and I do think that's one of the interesting things that she's doing. Like, she actually is taking social issues and bringing them explicitly into medicine work, right? In terms of helping women deal with the sort of the internalized dysfunctional programs that are gender-based that are hurting them, psycho-spiritually or psychologically. But she's also taking that work into the world in terms of doing the best that she can do to get women's voices into the scene, right? So she's providing them resources, and I was only at that conference because she decided to respond to an email that I sent her. So, I mean, she is doing work in the world, and she is doing work to help people come to terms with the way that the society is operating in their own interiority. So I think she's an interesting example of this sort of
and
like
for the listeners, for the listeners, that's Zoe Helena, and the organization is Cosmic Sister.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would like to see, and her focus is explicitly on gender, but there are many different ways that could be applied beyond gender as a governing framework of her intervention. So,
Well, since we're on politics, since we're there, and also actually just like as a quick reference back, when you were talking about this sort of like, it's a fetish we have about being the best that we can be or something. I think about a paraphrase from someone I look up to as an intellectual role model, or just a role model, right? Which is Stephen Jenkinson, and he makes a comment about personal growth, and he says the only thing that grows for itself is a tumor. So anyways, moving on from there, I wonder about, I understand that I understand the criticisms of saying, like, do we need to politicize every moment? Can there be just moments where it's just humans together and it's not politics? And I think that's a valuable consideration to have. And on another level, I think if politics aren't kept into consideration, we live in an extremely politicized world. And so if we don't think and consider politics, well, then we are going to be influenced by them, whether we like it or not. And when I think about the political forms that the political influence psychedelics seems to have, I think seems to be extremely positive ones. And maybe you feel similarly, or you want to expand on this, which is that with psilocybin anyways, the research says, the consequence of taking psilocybin is you have greater ecological mindfulness because you look upon the world and your self-construal is altered to include the natural world as an essence of yourself. And so you're usually more like cognizant of the impacts of your own behavior on the natural world. And it tends to result in anti-authoritarian values and behaviors. And we're currently in a world where the reality is near-term social ecological collapse because the system is not changing, and climate change is real, even if the context of it and the specifics of it could still be scientifically debated. It's not actually a scientific debate that we're fucked if we don't do something about it. And the reason why nothing is really being done about it is because there's this huge authoritarian political movement that's just trying to lock down on steady as she goes and prevent any type of actual like so-called liberal advances in politics. And that psychedelics might be, in some sense, a bit of an antidote for that. How do you feel about this?
Mm-hmm. Again, I'm going to just centralize myself somewhere because it's a huge question. I mean, you started off with a statement that I unfortunately deeply, I certainly agree with, which I'm very suspicious of the people who say that they're apolitical. Mm-hmm. Because when you say that you're apolitical, you're actually political without realizing it, and somebody is using you politically.
Yeah.
Right. So be political or be used for somebody else's political agenda. Mm-hmm. So when you say that you're apolitical, you're actually not. Right. That's an illusion. So in terms of like how psychedelics fit into that, I know that it's 100% true that for whatever reason, it's not particular to ayahuasca, people who are ingesting ayahuasca seem to have a great level of concern for the environment. Just touching on the environment piece for a second. And I think for me, when I've sort of dug into that with my research, it was because these forms of separation were being dismantled. So separation from self, separation from others, and the sense of separation from like the natural world or the environment that we're situated within. People come to realize that actually the destruction of the environment is the destruction of ourselves. It represents a form of self-destruction. Hmm. And so all of a sudden there's a deep level of concern and reverence for the natural world in ways that people who didn't even have that desire to reconnect in that way coming in actually leave with that. Does that change their environmental behavior? Actually, like there are studies that demonstrate it doesn't change very much of their interaction with the environment in substantial ways. Um, but I think it's pointing to this sort of ability of psychedelics to generate a greater level of awareness of the fact that like we are deeply connected to the struggle of the environment. It's not beyond us, right? Like we're actually destroying ourselves. And like when we're as we're allowing this to happen. But the other question I think is much more interesting, which is about authoritarianism. Because I mean, one of the other things that we come into contact with is this understanding of ourselves as deeply empowered, right? There's a great level of empowerment that comes, like in terms of the recognition that nobody is going to heal you but yourself. The doctor's not going to heal you. The relationship with the plant's not going to magically heal you, right? Like we're having to engage in a process in which we are taking responsibility for our healing. And that's a relationship between like the political relationship between a healer and the person being healed. But there is something that like the ability to question the forms of authority that you took for granted extends beyond sort of the healing relationship as well. The idea that other people know and you don't, or that somebody else knows better, or that you're like a passive sort of cog in the machinery. There's an intervention in that sort of default mode on many, many levels. And so I do think there's a greater level of responsibility that comes with the questioning of authority, right? When you actually like decide that or see that it's possible for you to actually have agency where you thought that you didn't. So, I mean, that's scary, right? Because then it's all on you, right? Like your healing process is all on you. The way you operate in the world, in your relationships to others, to the culture, to the political infrastructure, that's all on you. That's a lot of responsibility. However, that's also deeply empowering. That's like emancipatory, right? So it's two sides, right? It's scary. It requires action in the world and deliberate sort of agentic orientation to that which you're submerged in. But
it's like exiting childhood. We need to leave our childhood to become adults. I mean, it sounds to me like what you're describing is like the liberation and responsibility of being an adult and no longer being a child.
Yeah. And I kind of just got lost there because I was trying to weave through a bunch of different points, but I mean, in other words, like, I agree with what you said, and like I see that in multiple ways, unfolding in multiple layers, environmentally, in terms of a responsibility for your own healing work, in terms of your place in society and how you engage politically, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And I'm going to ask another political question, and I feel aware, and I imagine like many of my listeners are aware right now that there is so much to talk about insofar as the political issues of our time and on the problems on both sides of the partisan divide, the good and the bad, and just like the challenges that we're facing. But again, neither the time nor the place right here, right now in this podcast. And I want to zero in on something specifically that's relevant to ayahuasca before I ask you the final question, if that's okay with you. We've been going for a long time, but
I know.
This is great.
Sorry.
So
this is what happens.
This is great. I really like this. I want to make sure that you're still down to continue for a little bit longer because I don't want to miss out on the vibe we got here now. So this next political question is something like, I mentioned Kevin Tucker earlier, and I had spoken about his work in our email exchange, which is something along the lines of that ayahuasca today is the living expression of an ongoing history of resource extraction and the ever-present frontier of the devastation of culture, of body, of psyche, just like the destruction of people in the most violent and horrific ways since colonialism came in to South America, is a direct line from Pizarro and Columbus through the rubber boom straight into ayahuasca, and that ayahuasca in and of itself is even being claimed by some indigenous people. The ayahuasca tourism industry is a form of spiritual extractivism. And here we are, understandably sick as people of the modern culture, and we go down and we look at ayahuasca and we paint this noble savage type caricature of the indigenous people, and we go down to get their spiritual medicine, and as a consequence just further worsen the situation, taking from them what we want and what we need for our healing, only to some of us become fixated and go into it more and more and more, or to appropriate it and bring back our Shipibo print t-shirts and stuff and parade ourselves like ayahuasqueros, or, you know, or whatever it is, you know, like the white shaman complex. And like, those things are all very real, like those are very real issues. And yet, ayahuasca does have this positive healing potential. And when I brought this up to you, you seem very aware of the political complexity of this, and yet you continue to drink ayahuasca and to work at a center in Peru. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, way to put me on the spot, right? With the things that are always operating in my own, the set of contradictions that are arising in me all the time, right? Like it's really hard for me to walk around in Iquitos and not be deeply uncomfortable, like very hard. I mean, I'm someone before I started drinking ayahuasca who, if I had not drank ayahuasca and I had learned about this scene, I probably would have been thinking in exactly precisely the direction in which you just described. Mm-hmm. But entering into that landscape then sort of cracked me open to many different ways of thinking. Again, like earlier I mentioned this sort of like the tyranny of knowing, right? This like hyper criticality, which exhausts you and everyone else. And it's not that those forms of like that deep criticality is not extremely important, and that it's not important to wade into that territory, right? I actually think it's deeply important to be aware of the many dimensions of what's going on, right? That being one of them. All of this extractivist sort of colonialism. I mean, it's legitimate, right? It's legitimate, especially if you know your history, which I studied for, quite a long time, the history of capitalism, right? And sort of how colonialism fits into that, and resource extraction, and, especially being a U.S. citizen and trying to study the history of U.S. hegemony in Latin America. That's where I started, right? Like in undergraduate, that's what I was studying, U.S. imperialism in Latin America, and the many dimensions of that, the economic mechanisms upon which that turns. But there's something else, which I've learned along the way, before, even outside of medical work. Well, sorry, this dog. Which is that I don't like that framework of pure futility and pure criticality. It's one way of knowing and one way of seeing, which may be true inside of a particular orientation, right? But also, I don't know what the big picture is. I don't know what's really going on. Like I can see that small window of that which is going on, but I don't know what purpose that actually serves in the bigger picture of the evolution of humanity. Because I do know also that this is happening, whether we want it to or not. It's like at a certain point I became really wary of what I was doing to myself by being purely critical without finding any practice for my politics, right? Without finding any point of intervention. And whether or not we like it, the globalization of ayahuasca is happening. That flood of people into the Amazon is happening, right? So if people who have not, if the people who have studied that history of colonialism, the extractive relationship between global north and global south, if people who do not know about that history and are not deeply aware of it in their everyday interactions, in the way they're working in that field, which I think of as a liminal space now. I think about that space as the meeting of two worlds and a space in between which has opened up. And if there are not people with knowledge of that history inside of that context, then we're really screwed, right?
Yeah, no
So,
shit.
like, whether or not we like it, that is happening. And so it actually becomes really important for people who have a deep appreciation of that history to be operating in that liminal space, right? Which we can think about as a space of colonialism. But the reality also is that the plants are leaving the Amazon. It's not just about people coming into the Amazon to drink medicine. The plants are actually going all over the world, right? The plants themselves have gone outside of the Amazon, and people have come into the Amazon to get them. And so I think of it as like as a global liminal space, not just people coming into Peru to get it, right? Because the other thing after drinking a lot of ayahuasca that I'm wary of is that, this human-centered perspective, I'm not quite so sure of anymore. I'm not quite so sure that people from the global north, for example, the colonialists, the traditional colonialists, right, are actually running things. I'm not quite so sure that humanity is actually running things the way that we think it is. I'm not quite so sure what's actually going on and why at this moment in time the plants have left the Amazon and people are coming to the Amazon to get the plants, right? I'm not quite so positive that I understand all of the mechanics of that enough to be hypercritical without a great level of reservation and a great level of owning the fact that I don't know what's going on. And I also speak with the Shipibo about it too, because I had one interview with somebody who really he schooled me. I was Joe Tafur, and he was like, how dare you come in here with your perspective of this is wrong. And like the Shipibo themselves, when you speak to them about it, there's a very different perspective, right?
By this is wrong, you mean like people being there is wrong? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because when you speak with a lot of them, like that's not their response. And you can look at that as though they're, being subjected to colonialist ideology and, but that again is not giving them agency. That's convincing yourself that you know better than they do. When it's in many cases, these are the choices that they're making, and the choices that they're making to allow Westerners access to this tradition come from a place of knowing that I can't necessarily have access to. And so I also give them the respect as agents in this scene and people who have made deeply political decisions to allow us access to the traditions that they carried within themselves for so very long.
Right.
So their voices to me are very important as well. And their voices often also speak about the idea that this is the quote unquote will of the plants. And I don't, I'm not well versed enough to speak for them about their relationship with plants and how plants speak to them, right? Or make any kind of judgment other than just relay that many of them say that the plants made the decision. They didn't. So there's something going on and that I don't know about. And I have chosen at this point in my life, rather than just critiquing without a place of practice, to like be there and do the best that I can and get my hands dirty, because we need help and we cannot help ourselves. That's beyond evident at this point in time. Like, just like I sat in that balcony at one point and said, like, I need help, right? Like, we cannot help ourselves, many of us, most of us, right? Like, look where we're at.
Well, especially if we're still stuck in wounds. Like, if we're still stuck in wounds, we're still children, and we need help from something to grow into adulthood. And maybe that is the plants. And I love what you said there. I feel like that brought a really important perspective. I'm gonna make sure that this interview releases immediately after the interview with Kevin Tucker, so that I can tell people, like, just wait before you make any decisions. Just wait till next week, and then take the two into consideration, because I think that was an interesting point. It also made me think about Sam Gandy, who's a writer, researcher in England, and his essay called "Who's Trippin' Who?" And he suggests it's like, well, we think that humanity has dominated the planet, but maybe corn and wheat and soy have dominated the planet and are using us to dominate. It's like, and we just think we're so smart. But yeah, no, great perspective. The final question is really about integration. If you feel ready to go there.
Yeah, let's go there. Yeah.
So some people go to ayahuasca, and they go to ayahuasca with this sort of like insidious type of not so obvious racism, which is, the noble savage, like the ultimate shaman projection, and think that what's that?
It's fetishism. Yeah.
The fetishism. Okay, my speaking's not great, but you know what I meant. And subconsciously, they have this colonial extractivist sort of perspective, taking the plants, taking the indigenous cosmology, and some people get wrapped up in megalomania as a consequence of that. And some people end up like killing people in ceremony. Some people end up psychotic and broken after going into the jungle. Some even to the point of point blank murdering people, like Sebastian Woodroffe murdering Olivia Aravello. And some people are more benign, but some people just drink forever and ever and never really make any changes. And yet some people drink, and the experience they have is what you're talking about when you say healing. And they get to a point where they're ready to fully go back to their lives and better their lives and become different, more empowered, masterful people, and be good citizens. What makes the difference here between the people who just get lost in their own bullshit or end up in violence, and the people who end up being positively changed, and what they've ended up taking as a consequence of going to and participating in the extractivist economy of South America, end up bringing back onto the world something greater than what they took in that particular exchange?
Yeah, so I think that this is one of the very unfortunate impacts of the sort of break, right, between this moment, the earlier sort of mass interest in psychedelics, and this one that we're in right now, right? During that break, or that break was initiated by the sort of like illegality of psychedelics, the stigmatization, it's a form of stigma that came along with that illegality, which also represents an intervention in the development of a deeper understanding of how to work with them, a cultural and social infrastructure which is about teaching and mentoring people in terms of how to use these for healing purposes or for whatever beneficial purposes. I mean, people use them recreationally, and you can't really use ayahuasca recreationally, but I think also stigmatizing them recreationally is problematic as well. But this sort of illegality and stigma that's, has been attached to psychedelics has also prevented the development in our culture of a sort of a social and cultural infrastructure of practices which could help us understand how to work with them and how to integrate them and how to be responsible in our relationship to them. And so I think I'm going here because of this conversation about this guy, right? So this is this is touching on the dark side right here, or that we were just speaking about in terms of, there is a cultural divide between, like we're talking about Sebastian and Olivia.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a cultural divide, and due to this history that we had referred to, this history of colonialism and extractivism, there's also a great level of wariness and suspicion, and that the people living in the Amazon have toward us. Mm-hmm. And they're kind and they're open and they're beautiful in many ways. However, there's a certain measure of reserve with many of them for
understandably
understandable reasons, right? Yeah. And they're protecting their certain forms of knowledge that they have in relation to the plants. They're protecting their practices. They're protecting their traditions in some ways. And there's always going to be a sort of like blank space because of that history through which communication, and because of different worldviews and different cosmologies and different understandings of the world based upon these different cultural locations. But for me, of experience, but for me, like, this is the detrimental outcome of the stigma in our culture of psychedelics. We don't have people to teach us that um, that could act as elders or act as mentors or help us learn, right? Like, we don't just automatically know how to work with psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
This is like, you had mentioned in that question about like megalomania, right? This is the guy who, like, we have people who come down and like they drink once in there or twice, like, I'm God. Everybody else, I am God. Like, welcome to, to heaven, guys, because I'm God, right? So, and this is because, not through no fault of that person's own, but they haven't been given an education about how to work with psychedelics as sort of ayahuasca especially speaks in metaphor. So rather than interpreting the information that they're given explicitly, right, people need guidance to learn to work with something that speaks in a different way than they're used to. Mm. People need guidance for integration practices. I mean, one of the biggest questions that people who come to the temple have when they leave is like, well, I think I know what integration is, but like, really, what is it? Like, how do I do it? Right? So like, we haven't developed educational frameworks or social or cultural frameworks through which to transmit really important information about how to have responsible relationships with psychedelics. And in terms of integration, I mean, that's really, really important because you have to take what it is that you learned and transmit it into your life and into the world in a meaningful way, and that's healing. Where am I going with this? I'm like lost in another tangent.
I have something that I'm thinking about here, and maybe it's the reference point you need. Maybe it'll just provide you with insight as to what you actually wanted to say. And I think about this, and I think about it in reference to James Kent. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work he's been doing over the last 2 years in psychedelic culture, but it's very disruptive and very hypercritical. But I think, and I disagree with him on several cosmological angles, but incredible work. And one of the things he suggests is that psychedelics are just fundamentally incompatible with Western culture. And in many ways, I actually completely agree. Because you have these experiences, say, in Peru or at the Ayahuasca Center and so on and so forth. And then for most of us aren't lucky, like I'm lucky, to have a community of people who aren't necessarily psychedelic people, but they have a mindfulness of building generative culture and living a way of life that expresses what could be right about the world rather than being lost in or hypercritical about what's wrong. Most people just show up to the world as it was before they left, unchanged, and they see all the problems now. But as far as as far as everyone else is concerned, there are no problems, which makes them the problem. Yeah. And so then an answer to that is like, okay, well, I mean, maybe that's why people end up just going back to ayahuasca over and over again, because it's impossible to take it home with them in some sense. And so, maybe psychedelics are fundamentally incompatible with Western culture, but is the answer then not to take them or to change the culture?
I think what he's pointing to is legitimate, but also I would intervene, right, and say, I don't think that they're incompatible. I think that what he's pointing to is the need for us to do a lot of work, right, as a movement, as people involved with psychedelics in ways that we hope are more meaningful. Like, this is a constant battle that I have within myself is we can take people and help them, right? We can help them in this context. We can clean them up a little bit, right? We can give them something. Is that going to last when they go home? Because they're going back to the cultural and social context within which the illness emerged. And that culture is going to, and their life circumstances are going to reinforce the very thing which they came to heal, which they did work on when they were in the Amazon, because they were removed from it. Mm-hmm. And because they were with people who were engaged in the same project as them, being better human being and like working with psychedelics in order to do so. But like you're saying, I mean, when I first went home, it was really alienating because I didn't have anyone. To me, that doesn't point to incompatibility. That points to, again, the dysfunction of our own culture and the need for us to actually do work, right? Yeah, for us to actually build within that structure. And this, to me, is also why it's not enough to think about psychedelics as forms of individual healing. If we think about it as individualizable healing, we're always going to have that context, which is incompatible with our forms of self-transformation, which we want to make collective so that we can do better, so that we don't go back and have these patterns reinforced and are unable to escape the sickness, right? So I kind of think, not to, I don't want to insult him because he's pointing to something really good, but that's kind of a cop-out to me, kind of. Mm-hmm. Rather than like, roll up your sleeves and let's actually do some work, right? Let's come to terms with the reality that we're facing, look it in the face, and then say, okay, what do we do now? So what are we going to do about that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's the futility.
I agree. And to be fair, I might have mischaracterized his work and certainly blended it with my own perspective, although, he was a reference, not so much a quote. But I really agree. I really agree with where you're coming from. And I want to say something about futility. And I also want to just leave it here, actually, because that was a really great sort of closing remarks from you. Samantha, this has been awesome conversation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I feel bad a little bit because like I said, I have 8 million directions in my mind. I want to go to every single question and then I kept getting lost, but I really enjoyed it. Yeah. Regardless, amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. For the listeners, although you did mention at the beginning, you're a hidden agent in the larger scene.
I'm a recluse.
Yeah. But is there a place where people who are curious about what you're doing can learn more about what you're doing?
I might have to follow up with you about that because I'm actually in the stage where I'm finished with everything. I'm writing my dissertation, but that's a project that's going to be in the works in terms of making it public. So I honestly, right now, I don't really, I have like my email and that's about it. I want to have a website, but I'm not really, I don't have a very good public presence.
That's okay. Not all of us need to be influencers and public figures. I really appreciate what you offer. If you do end up having some places where people can go to learn more about your work by the time this gets released, I'll be sure to include it in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com.
I should have a website or something. I know someday soon.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. So again, thank you very much for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So good to talk to you. Yeah.
And cut. Okay, well, awesome. Thank you very much, Samantha. Thank you, listeners, for staying all the way to the end. This was a longer episode, and I'm happy that the episodes are getting longer because I feel like the content is it's going to these richer, deeper places that it's hard to get to in less than 60 minutes. So I do appreciate having these longer episodes, although not all the episodes coming up will be that long. Links to Samantha's work and how you can learn more about her work can be found in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com for episode 97. Links to that are, basically wherever you're listening to this, there's a link to go over to the show notes and you can essentially get those connections to Samantha's work. In regards to Samantha's comments on Tucker's interview, episode 96, I do want to say that Samantha, when I asked her these questions, hadn't read Kevin's work. So that's an important context for you to keep in mind insofar as her comments on his perspective are, though her opinions on the matter in general are deep and well-informed, she hasn't, as far as I know, actually read Kevin's work. So keep that in mind. And what an interesting thing to be considering right now with there's like the huge upheavals that we are currently going through and about to go through as a global community with, environmental and social collapse coming in the near term. The UN report of 1 million species going extinct as a consequence of human, behaviors and like the rapid, like very fast, rapid melting of the permafrost in the northern parts of the world, and that it's, I think I heard, releasing more than 50% more carbon into the atmosphere than scientists initially expected, which is only going to speed up global warming. We're in a lot of trouble here, so there's a lot of big things to be thinking about right now. none of that even points to the the large complexities of political extremism that's just continuing to grow. So yeah, there's a lot to be thinking about here. I'm thinking about it a lot. That's why I'm including it here in the podcast. And although some of the other episodes won't be so politically informed as things go on, I'm inviting you to think deeply about the struggles that we're going through right now as people and as a global community, and to find others to grieve with if you can, because there's lots of grief to be had with what's happening right now in the world. So thanks for listening. Thanks for going all the way to the end of this long episode and listening to this little bit of a, not desperate, but like kind of desperate plea for some sort of recognition, social recognition of our challenges here at the end, and for supporting the show by sharing this episode with a friend or generally on social media, or by supporting the show financially, becoming a patron at patreon.com/JamesWJesso, getting involved in the perks there, or discussing this episode on the subreddit @Mind Podcast. Yeah, or just buying merch. JamesWJesso.com/support for all the financial support options. And yeah, thanks again. I'll see you on the next episode. Take care.